Hi everybody, welcome. Thank you for being here and for your continued support. The exams are over and the winter break is about to start. We do not have all these results yet, but I nearly lost it when Dragon Man came home with the news that he scored 91% for physics. Anyway, with that bit of good news, we need to move on to today's video. I know it may disappoint you, but I'm not going to join the crowd and talk about Harry and Meghan's visit over and over and over again. It is what they want. They want the attention and publicity, and I, for one, am not going to give it to them. Not yet, okay? I do not care where they stay, whether in Highgrove or Althorpe with Uncle Charles Spencer. I think it would be the second best option for them, as Meghan can take photographs of Archie and Lily at Grandma Diana's grave. How lovely, and in my opinion, sick. Moving on. I'm currently knee-deep into Norman Baker's work on royal finances, doing my own research, because the idea or the feeling I am getting about Norman Baker's work is that he is holding back quite a lot. He talks figures, some new, but a lot of it is indeed old news. Interestingly, according to Norman Baker, Charles is worth $3 billion with a B dollars and not 600 million like mainstream media wants us to believe, or even 1.8 billion according to the Guardian's estimate. Well, no matter how wishy-washy Norman Baker's reporting is in places, something should be as clear as day to all of us. Something is indeed rotten in the state of Denmark, or then the state of the United Kingdom. Now, before we proceed, I just want to make one thing very clear. We have heard some negative stuff about the Queen lately, particularly in terms of Andrew. But at this point, I'm not even searching to blame her for any of it, because it is 100% true that Charles had taken over the handling of finances and the business end of the monarchy long before the Queen passed away. I'm not sure exactly when. Maybe it was a gradual process. I'm not exactly sure. But what is sure is that for at least 5 years preceding the death of the Queen, Charles had been cooking the books, so to speak. We also know that there's currently an investigation into Andrew's crooked deals. But much worse than that, at least for me, is that some of Charles's crooked deals are indeed public knowledge, and others, shall we say, are open secrets. Yet no one, including Norman Baker, is actually talking about this. At this point, I want to repeat what I said before. Britain is at a very precarious point or place in history. I would call it an explosive turning point. Something I think William has an inkling about, but Charles absolutely stubbornly refuses to acknowledge. I do not think this is the right time, politically or otherwise, to abolish the monarchy. The monarchy in its way, I know it's a lot of PR, but I tend to agree with at least this part. It does bring continuity. And more than that, it is part of British culture and identity. And at the moment, there isn't much room for the British people to maneuver and evolve. But the way Charles had effectively run the monarchy for the past 10 years is indeed untenable. The monarchy appears to take more and more and more and give less and less and less, at least to its own people, to the British people. And as the scandals grow, so does the lies, in particular from Buckingham Palace. Now, I personally hate that for the British people. Absolutely hate that for the entire world. No one who had loyally supported the monarchy deserves that. I spoke recently about Catherine's clothing and promoting British brands and thus effectively yet passively contributing to the GDP of Britain. This is indeed important to the individual brands, I would say. But overall, the influence on the country's gross domestic product, or GDP, is not as huge as the palace tried to spin it or would want you to believe. Now ask yourself, this is a very practical example. Ask yourself the next time little Charlotte wears something and the next day the media shouts it out that the dress sold out within hours. It may be true, that's not what I'm saying, but just how much would the profit had been, or how much would the profit be that was actually generated through the selling out of that dress? 5,000, 10,000, maybe at a stretch 20,000, although I sincerely doubt that. But what does that kind of amount contribute to the economy? Well, I can tell you, something like 0.00001% on a good day, and often not even calculable in the grander scheme of things. Then there's also the Royal Warrant, which supposedly endorses British luxury goods and the export of these luxury items. Now, although Asia and North America are still fascinated by the royal coat of arms on certain items, the export again and still has been greatly inflated over the years and does not seem to carry the same weight it did when Queen Elizabeth II was in her heyday. The pro-monarchy groups often also use the tourism argument as a blanket defense of the monarchy's costs. But how true and real is that? They argue that people travel to see the history, architecture, and heritage, which is indeed true. But the tourists who arrive for this reason do not track the actual live royals as a distinct attraction and would likely visit the same places whether there is a current monarchy or not. I've said this before. Places like Versailles in France and the Forbidden City in Beijing draw millions of paying visitors annually, despite the fact that those countries have abolished their monarchies over a century ago. There is another issue with this argument, and economists call it the data gap. You see, when consultancies estimate royal tourism revenue, they generally do so by adding up the ticket sales of any and all historic sites with royal ties, including places like the Tower of London. There is no data proving that tourists would not show up if the buildings were state-run museums. You will also be told that the pageantry connected to the monarchy, like coronations and royal weddings and jubilees, act as a big global primetime commercial for brand Britain. And also that the daily pageantry, like the changing of the guard, the working carriages, add a mystique which a stagnant historical museum cannot. That said, what no one explains to the nation of gullible taxpayers is the distinction between passive heritage, like the changing of the guard, which requires standard military personnel who are already on the payroll, and active state events like Trooping the Colour and the state opening of Parliament, which require massive event-specific public funding. And no, it is not paid from the sovereign grant. It is paid directly by the state. When you break down the financial reality of these large-scale events, it becomes obvious that most of the spin is mostly bullshittery, and that these events potentially cost more than they bring in. There is, of course, and that is specifically what I am referring to, there is what they like to call the hidden bill, the one which is never put out separately, but if you know where to look or who to ask, then also not impossible to find for yourselves. This hidden bill refers to the policing, the logistics and crowd management during a major royal event. Now this is fully funded by the Home Office and local councils. Here is but one example. Charles's 2023 coronation cost taxpayers, at the very least, conservatively calculated, £72 million, or then $94 million. And a staggering £21.7 million of that went solely to policing. So what people do not even think about or calculate into the cost of the monarchy is that trooping, for instance, is basically just a scaled down version of the coronation, which still requires thousands of police officers, extensive road closures, counter-terrorism measures, etc., etc. The other thing you, as the British taxpayer, are not told about is the displacement effect during major state events. Now, I'm going to exclude royal weddings, okay? Excluding that. British taxpayers are made to believe that tourists are rushing to London for these annual events like trooping and opening of Parliament. But that is not true. Your regular high-spending tourists actually avoid London during these events due to inflated hotel prices, closed-off streets, and a gridlocked public transport. And that often results in a net wash or loss for local businesses. Okay, outside of the hospitality industry. Then the royals and their supporting public also need to wake up and smell the roses. There is a definite generational shift in interest. They are trying to steer away from it, but the Queen's final Jubilee trooping with its peak TV viewership already showed a drop to roughly 7.5 million on BBC. Okay, I'm just taking BBC figures, okay? Subsequent annual parades under Charles, however, dropped to barely 4 million on BBC. And that is excluding the very last trooping which was held this month. Now I've tried, but there were an even greater drop in attendance of trooping this year. But no matter how hard I tried, there were no official figures, not even from the BBC. Now, I can't suck a number out of my thumb for, say, the BBC viewership. Okay? Can't do that, won't do that. But I can tell you what was painfully obvious and reported by the public. In previous decades, getting a spot right on the barriers of the mall required camping overnight, or at least arriving at dawn. This year, latecomers could easily walk up and find standing room. We don't need figures to know that the raw volume of attendees has significantly decreased. In previous years, we also saw the paid stands chock-a-block, full, not a single seat available. This year, there were plenty empty seats. There is yet another problem, a bit of cooking of the books, or rather a bit of gaslighting happening. You see, it is difficult to pinpoint the income attributed to the royal family against what they actually receive from the state, because this is how it works. Let's take Buckingham Palace. It is part of the Crown Estate portfolio, yet it is not managed by the Crown Estate like other properties in their portfolio, but it is deemed occupied by the royal family and therefore managed by the royal household. The king and the queen before him thus had to manage, which includes paying wages for staff like maids, cooks, etc. I mean, all the staff excluding security, police, army, etc. And they had to do so from the or out of the sovereign grant. So all Buckingham Palace staff, excluding security, were paid from the sovereign grant. When Buckingham Palace became due for major renovations, the Queen's annual sovereign grant was raised from £42.8 million to £82.2 million. And that was going to happen for the next 10 years, which will only expire next year. Now that extra money was to include the expense of the renovations. It is expected that the sovereign grant, however, will amount to 137.9 million in the 2026-2027 book year, a year in which the actual renovations are not applicable anymore. The sovereign grant is paid to the king by the state, and it equals a percentage of the Crown Estate's net profit. However, and this is where the catch comes, the ticket sales at Buckingham Palace does not go to the royal household and nor to the Crown Estate. Ticket sales and public access to Buckingham Palace are managed and received by the Royal Collection Trust. Okay, so where does that profit go? The money goes to, wait for it, the care and conservation of the royal collection. Okay, now everyone sees the royal collection as the paintings and the jewelry, but it can also include, say, a doorknob. If that doorknob was fitted to the door 400 years ago and it's still copper, then it is still seen as an antique and something that needs to be preserved, and then it will fall under the royal collection. So, as soon as the East Wing's renovations were completed, Charles, for the first time ever, opened it to the public at a whopping £75 for access. So, do you spot what I'm spotting? The more money the Royal Collection Trust earns, the less small renovations and maintenance the sovereign grant has to pay, and the more money is left to disappear into the deep pockets of King Charles. It is also my belief that this whole complicated setup of who pays what and what is for whose account, etc., is done exactly and precisely to do what it is doing to us today, namely to confuse us, also to not enable us to do the actual calculations, to do the sums, to compare, etc. Okay, guys, but this, I think, is enough for now. There's still a lot more, but I don't want to, and I don't want you to suffer from information overload. As a basic synopsis, so far we can conclude that, number one, it is not exactly true that the royal family earn the country more than they receive from the country. It hasn't been proven, maybe 25, 30 years ago, but currently highly doubtful. Number two, it is also clear that they cost the country more than what is being disclosed to the public. Now next we'll talk about some dubious business connections, names we have not heard before, at least not in connection with the royals, and thus you may not be too pleased, or you may even be very surprised. I don't know. We'll see when we get to it. So until then, please take good care of yourselves, stay vigilant, and stay safe. Bye.